of being loved. Love is not merely a feeling. It is an experience that engages the whole person, body and soul, intellect and will. It is a choice for the good of others. The love of neighbor flows from an intimate encounter with the living God. Nationalism. The Christian message regarding love of neighbor has a universal appeal which helps us realize the unity of the human family, rooted in the unity of God, who is communion of love. Pope John the 23rd wrote, I quote, "The unity of the human family has always existed because its members are human beings, all equal by virtue of their natural dignity. Hence, there will always exist the objective need to promote, in a sufficient measure, the universal common good, which is the common good of the entire human family," unquote. In this context, we can discuss the issue of nationalism. The centrality of the human person and the natural inclination to form relationships leads men and women to establish nations, to realize the unity of the human family. Each nation has its own distinctive characteristics and culture. The Catholic Church recognizes the importance of national sovereignty and culture, which constitutes the guarantee for the preservation of the identity of a people and expresses and promotes its spiritual sovereignty. In addressing the United Nations in 1995, Pope John Paul II distinguished a healthy patriotism from an unhealthy nationalism. He lamented the fact that some perceive difference and the reality of the other as a threat, leading to cycles of violence, obscuring the fundamental commonality that we share as persons. He said, I quote, "In this context, we need to clarify the essential difference between an unhealthy form of nationalism, which teaches contempt for other nations and cultures, and patriotism, which is a proper love of one's country. True patriotism never seeks to advance the well-being of one's own nation at the expense of others. For in the end, this would harm one's own nation as well. Doing wrong damages both aggressor and victim. Nationalism, particularly in its most radical forms, is thus the antithesis of true patriotism. And today, we must ensure that extreme nationalism does not continue to give rise to new forms of aberrations of totalitarianism. This is a commitment which also holds true, obviously, in cases where religion itself is made the basis of nationalism, as unfortunately happens in certain manifestations of so-called fundamentalism, unquote. This past March, on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, Pope Francis addressed the issue of nationalism and its aggressive forms. I quote, "Forms of populism are instead the fruit of an egotism that hems people in and prevents them from overcoming and looking beyond their own narrow vision. There is a need to start thinking, to avert the opposite dangers of a dreary uniformity or the triumph of particularisms. Politics needs this kind of leadership, which avoids appealing to emotions to gain consent, but instead in a spirit of solidarity and subsidiarity," unquote. The antidote to nationalism is solidarity, which entails the awareness of being part of a single body, while at the same time involving a capacity on the part of each member to sympathize with others and with the whole. While the Church is supportive of patriotism and cultures, she rejects nationalism, which is close to other peoples and cultures based on racial, ethnic, and religious difference. As a remedy, she proposes a culture of encounter and solidarity which can serve as the basis of mutual enrichment. War. One of the risks of extreme nationalism is war. Church teaching regarding war falls under the commandments: you shall not kill, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We began by speaking of human dignity. Human life is sacred because from the beginning it involves the creative action of God and remains forever in a special relationship with the Creator. No one has the right to directly destroy or take the life of an innocent human being. Each person has the right to defend his or her life from an unjust aggressor. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states, love toward oneself remains a fundamental principle of morality. Therefore, it is legitimate to insist on respect for one's own right to life. Someone who defends his life is not guilty of murder, even if he is forced to deal his aggressor a lethal blow. However, one may not use more force than necessary to defend one's life. One not only has the right to self-defense, but at times one may have the duty to defend the lives of those for whom one is responsible. In his 1948 Christmas message, Pope Pius XII said, among the goods of humanity, some are of such importance for society that it is perfectly lawful to defend them against unjust aggression. Their defense is even an obligation for the nations as a whole, who have a duty not to abandon a nation that is attacked. When force is used, it is used to protect and defend life and the common good. The Church obliges all citizens and governments to work for the avoidance of war. Still, peace is not the mere absence of war. Rather, it is the work of justice and the fruit of charity. Within the Catholic tradition, strict criteria were developed over time for the use of force. At one and the same time, the following must be met for the use of force to be considered legitimate defense. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation and community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical and ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destructions weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. Even when this condition exists, not every military action is legitimate. The Church teaches that non-combatants, wounded soldiers, prisoners must be respected and treated humanly, and that actions deliberately contrary to the law of nations and to its universal principle are crimes, as are the orders that command such actions. Blind obedience does not suffice to excuse those who carry them out. Thus, the extermination of a people, nation, and ethnic minority must be condemned as a mortal sin. One is morally bound to resist orders that command genocide. Furthermore, the Catechism teaches, I quote, every act of war directed to the indiscriminate indiscriminate destruction of whole cities and vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. A danger of modern warfare is that it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially atomic, biological, and chemical weapons, to commit such crimes. With the continuing evolution of warfare and weaponry, some have suggested that the just war theory is obsolete. This year, on the occasion of the 50th World Day of Peace, Pope Francis issued a message entitled "Non-Violence, a Style of Politics for Peace." Acknowledging the wars of the last century, the Pope suggests that presently we are engaged in a, I quote, horrifying war fought piecemeal through conventional wars, acts of terrorism, organized crime, abuse of migrants, human trafficking, and environmental destruction. Experience teaches that violence is not the cure for brokenness of this world. At best, violence leads to forced migrations, suffering, and waste of precious resources. At worst, it leads to death, physical and spiritual. There are numerous examples of non-violence, yielding impressive results in the promotion of peace by Christians and non-Christians. One recalls the marvelous example offered by Mother Teresa of Calcutta, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and others. In the last century, the fall of communism and the peaceful transition that followed occurred largely without the use of violence, but through the weapons of truth and justice. The true battlefield, where violence and peace are engaged, is the human heart. Non-violence and peace are not passive, but active. Jesus preached unconditional love, even of enemies, which constitutes the Magna Carta of Christian non-violence. Pope Francis suggests that violence and injustice must be countered with more love and more goodness. This active non-violence is more than a mere practice, a mere political strategy. It is a way of life found in many religious traditions. It must be practiced within families and within the human family. The way of life in this human family cannot be based on the logic of fear and violence, but rather must be rooted in responsibility, respect, and dialogue. In addition to calling for disarmament, the Holy Father also calls for an end to domestic violence and the abuse of women and children. He exhorts world leaders to limit the use of force, favoring peace building through active non-violence. Pope Francis offered political and religious leaders, heads of international institutions, and business and media executives a challenge to apply the Beatitudes in the exercise of their responsibilities. In this way, they will act truly as peacemakers. To this end, the Holy Father pledged the assistance of the Church in every effort to build peace through active and creative non-violence. Finally, since we have a common home, we have a common task. Nothing is impossible if we turn to God in prayer. Everyone can be an artisan of peace. Poverty. One of the greatest threats to peace is poverty, rooted in a lack of fraternity. From the very beginning, the Church has tried to respond to material, spiritual, and social poverty as an expression of her faith in the God who is love. Love is the service of the church carries out, the service the church carries out to attend constantly to man's sufferings and needs, both spiritual and material. In the early church, believers held all things in common. There was no longer a distinction between rich and poor. All shared things in common. This radical sharing speaks to an interior attitude of detachment from material possessions and of using one's goods in the service of neighbor. The earliest community realized that being a disciple of Jesus meant demonstrating fraternity and solidarity in obedience to the Jesus proclamation that the poor are blessed and heirs to the kingdom of heaven. The exercise of charity is one of the essential activities of the church, but charity is not a kind of welfare activity which would be equally left to others, but is an expression of the church's nature, an indispensable expression of her being. Indeed, the Bible indicates that Christians are called to love in both word and deed. Little children, let us not love in word and speech, but in deed and in truth. Earlier, I mentioned that the Good Samaritan, the story pushes Christians to a universal love, especially of the poor. There is a special love that God has for the poor, so much so that God became poor himself in the person of Jesus. Thus, we speak of a preferential option for the poor. In his message, The Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis pointed out that the preferential option for the poor is principally a theological category, as God shows the poor his first mercy, and that this divine preference has consequences for the faith life of all Christians, since we are called to have this mind which was in Jesus Christ. The option for the poor is not a mere social activism. Rather, it is a loving attentiveness, the beginning of a true concern for their person, which inspires me effectively to seek their good. Thus, the response to poverty means not only doing things for the poor, but being with them, being close to them, and loving them. Pope Francis writes, I quote, "We may think that of the poor simply as the beneficiaries of our occasional volunteer work, or of impromptu acts of generosity that appease our conscience. However, good and useful such acts may be for making us sensitive to people's needs and the injustices that are often their cause, they ought to lead to a true encounter with the poor and a sharing that becomes a way of life." End of quote. The Pope encourages us not only to find Christ in the poor, to lend our voices to their causes, but also to be their friends, to listen to them, to speak for them, and to embrace the mysterious wisdom that God wishes to share with us through them. The response to poverty is rooted in the Church's love for God and neighbor. It is a grateful response to the call of God to be a steward of the goods of creation in the service of humanity. Wealth and riches are not evil. Rather, they fulfill their function when they produce benefits for others and for society. Poverty is the yardstick that allows us to judge how best to use material goods and to build relationships that are neither selfish nor possessive, affirming human dignity. It is impossible, you would understand that, to summarize the entire social doctrine of the Church. especially with respect to nationalism, war, and poverty, in such a brief period of time, even if this time has been too long for you. I believe though that one could state simply that in loving one's neighbor, Christians believe they are also loving God, who made man and women in his image and likeness. The fundamental nature and dignity that we share unite humanity in solidarity, fraternity, and concern for one another as we search for path to peace, understanding, and mutual respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop, for that inspiring word speech. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Svatmavidyananda. I have heard Swamini many times before. She is an inspiring speaker. She has a beautiful way of simplifying difficult concepts, making them interesting as well as meaningful to everyday life. She is a disciple of Puja Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who till recently was the foremost scholar and teacher of Vedanta, and a prominent leader and a spokesperson for the Hindu tradition. Swami Svatmavidyananda is a spiritual director of Arsha Vijnana Gurukulam, a non-profit center for study of Vedanta and Sanskrit, which is active in Maryland, Georgia, and Oregon. She teaches and travels widely. In fact, she just came from overseas trip a day ago, and she's here again to join us and inspire us. She's been involved with the Interfaith movement for peace and harmony amongst religions. She has represented Hinduism at many interfaith gatherings, including those organized by United Nations. She's also a visiting professor at the Department of Hindu Dharma Studies at the Graduate Theological Union Seminary in Berkeley, California. She speaks several languages. The 7 languages that I know of: English, Hindi, Tamil, Kannada, Marathi, and many more, perhaps. But the most important is, I think she speaks the language of love. She speaks the language of action. She speaks the language of intellect, the Jnana Yoga, the Karma Yoga, and the Bhakti Yoga. You are in for a treat. With that, Swamini, please.
I think so. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Your Excellency, Archbishop Pierre, distinguished scholars, guests from the Hindu and the Catholic traditions, and my dear friends. The Hindu greeting is Namaste. And when we say Namaste, we bring our hands together. The hands are different from one another. The dominant hand is bigger. The fingerprints also don't match. And yet, they don't fight. My left hand doesn't fight with the right hand, or vice versa. And when we bring our hands together, the differences between the hands are peacefully and prayerfully accommodated, even transcended. So the word namaste, namaha, te, means salutations unto you. And it is one sign in the Hindu tradition that encapsulates the entire Hindu philosophy and in all its diversity and complexity. All that is here is one, we are all one. I live in my space, you live in yours, and I give you the freedom to be who you are, no matter who you are. And I appreciate you for what you are without trying to change who you are. This is the meaning of Namahate, Namaste. I'm very happy with this dialogue. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. I commend all the organizers from both sides for working tirelessly to facilitate this. And the point of any kind of a dialogue is to understand one another, is to hear one another, and to listen to all the things that each of us have to say with respect and with appreciation, while at the same time accepting our differences gladly. And it is another point of the dialogue is to continue to live together and learn from one another in a spirit of mutual respect. So a few things. It was very interesting that when I received the nuncio's talk, it was very similarly organized as mine. It was very interesting. We have never met, but the exact same categorization and the exact same things were there in both the talks. So I too begin with a small introduction and an entry into the Hindu tradition before focusing on the three topics that we are to address today. Our religion, like yours, is based on revelation. The Veda is the holy text of the Hindus. In fact, we shouldn't call it a text because it was orally transmitted and preserved for many, many, many thousands of years. We stopped counting after 5,000. And then it is, transmitted from teacher to student, mother to son, father to daughter, etc. And that is how it has been kept among various families to this day. It is still an oral tradition even after writing it down. And so in the beginning there was only one Veda, but then for ease of transmission and memorization it was divided into 4 and then kept through many lineages. We have many lineages with different beliefs, but we do not worship many gods. This you know that already. Yes, because we are into the third Hindu-Catholic dialogue. It's not the first one. So rather than wade into this one god, many gods controversies, I can just repeat what my teacher very effectively used to say, that there is only God. Everything for us, is a manifestation of God. There is only one presence in the universe, and that presence is that of God, which is there, which pervades everything. The air we breathe, the light of the sun, trees, clouds, Mother Earth, and even all the bodies in this room and elsewhere are just manifestations of that one sentient, limitless presence called Ishvara, God, who in essence is nameless and formless. But from the immanent standpoint, what we say is that this presence, without undergoing any change whatsoever, blesses and pervades and animates everything, starting with this body-mind complex. So therefore we have in the Hindu tradition the freedom to invoke God through many names, forms, functions, and universal laws. And just like the Catholics do not worship the cross, we do not worship idols or graven images. The form is simply a means to connect with what it represents, the source of the universe, and adore that and worship that. So this is the common philosophy that underlies all strains of the Hindu traditions. For us, God is not a matter that is based on belief, but it is something to be understood throughout this life. That's why this life is given, in order to understand what is the meaning of the word God and what is my connection to this, what I call God. That is what this life is meant for, to discover that. And so derived from the same Veda, there are many interpretations on one's relationship with God. And one of our sects is exactly like the Catholic tradition. Exactly like that. There is really not much difference. We say that God is in heaven. They say that God is in heaven. We say that, okay, we have to have a certain relationship and we have to, live a certain kind of a life. And then, there are certain other ways of looking at the same Veda. I am part of God, says another sect of a dominant sect of the Hindu tradition. And then, there is one more that says that you are non-separate from that which you call God, because that presence is not outside. That presence which you adore and seek to know is not outside of who you are. So this is, briefly the Hindu vision of God. We have a similar, parallel, with regard to this love of one's neighbor as oneself in the Christian tradition. It appears in the Taittiriya Upanishad as an injunction, as a mandate really. We have very few mandates, but this is one of them. And I'll say it in Sanskrit first, Atithi Devo Bhava, meaning may you be one. Or rather, it's not even may, it's not polite, it's just be one. And who should you be? You should be one for whom the guest is a manifestation of God. And this is what is the meaning of Atithi Devo Bhava. Atithi doesn't mean guest, actually. Atithi means Tithihi navidyate yasya, the one who drops without an appointment. Yeah. Somebody who just comes. And without notice. Faced with such a guest, the Veda enjoins every Hindu to look upon, that guest with the same elation and ecstasy that you might have when faced with God. When you come face to face with God, what might be your emotions, And the same thing, you have to deal with the guest and you have to greet the guest in the same way, regardless of whether the guest is an in-law or an outlaw. Doesn't matter. So this is, as you can see, this is a little, this makes our history very interesting. And